I'm here with Aaron Hamlin, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Election Science. Thank you so much for being here today, Aaron.
Thanks, Jenny.
Can you help our listeners understand what is the Center for Election Science's mission? What are you guys doing over there?
So we study different aspects of voting methods, and also, like, having gone through a bit of that progress, we have settled on the one that we are advocating for, which is a method called approval voting, to pick as many candidates as you want. So just one, no ranking or anything like that. And we're working to get this method, approval voting, where you can pick as many as you want, implemented into cities and states. And so that's the big project that we're working on now.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit more about approval voting. How does that work, and why is it beneficial for voters?
Yeah. So normally when you go and you're going to vote, you have this ballot in front of you. And on that ballot, you see some instructions that says, choose one candidate. And because of that, it causes all kinds of problems. So particularly when you have a ballot with a bunch of candidates on there, which is not uncommon for local elections or in primaries, you may like more than one candidate, or you may like a candidate, but they don't seem very viable. And you're forced to pick another candidate who maybe you're okay with, but don't really like it so much. You'd really just like to support this other candidate. And so you find yourself in this dilemma, and because a lot of voters have to kind of split their vote because they can't support multiple candidates, support for a particular like slate or ideology of candidates can get divided, so that they have an artificially low support. And also newcoming candidates with new ideas, they can get an artificially low amount of support. And at the end of the day, like, we have this unique opportunity where, like, at an election time, those in power, they can't ignore you. They can't ignore your vote. So it's all the more important that we have this really strong tool. And right now, as I just described, we have a pretty bad tool for voting or expressing how we feel about the candidates that who are going to be potentially elected to the government, and making these really important decisions about our day-to-day lives and about how our tax money is spent. And so when we look at this, okay, we say this is like a critical point, and so maybe we shouldn't have this super inexpressive voting method that causes all this vote splitting, and maybe we should have a very simple alternative that gets the job done in terms of being able to measure the support for these candidates. And that's why we look at approval voting, because there, with approval voting, you get, like, it does a bunch of things like really well. It does a good job in terms of getting a consensus winner. It does a good job of measuring candidate support, and it's easy. Like, it's just like, imagine like check boxes for each of these candidates, and still most votes wins. So we see this as a really simple solution to give voters agency at a time when they really need it.
Right, right. And I know that you guys have been pretty successful in raising awareness about this idea of approval voting and getting it implemented in a couple places. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we've worked with local communities to get implemented in 2 cities so far. The first was Fargo, North Dakota. Fargo was an interesting story in that, like a lot of cities, they had a vote splitting issue. Candidates were winning with like 30%, and it was unclear on like what kind of support the winners had, or if they were the right winner at all. And it was so bad, the commission from Fargo created a task force. And in that task force, one of the members had reached out to us, because when you Google voting methods, we come up. And we had a discussion and talked about approval voting and how it might fit for them, particularly in Fargo. Like, they didn't have like state-of-the-art voting machines, and so they needed something also simpler, pretty simple. And he took it back to the task force. Task force got on board, recommended approval voting, and then the commission, who set up the task force to solve this problem, just sat on their hands and did nothing after the recommendation came forward that they wanted approval voting. And so the member on the task force, Jed, who's this kind of opposing 6'6" guy, who has to kind of duck through some of the doorways. He he got a bunch of people that he knew and gathered signatures to get it on the ballot. And so we continued working with him, and they ran a really exciting campaign, and it passed in Fargo, North Dakota by 63%. And now when they run elections, they have candidates winning by a clear amount of support. And so the last winner there, like the winner had over 50% approval, and they've got like 6 or 8 candidates now for their upcoming mayoral election this year, and they don't have to worry about vote splitting in the way that they had before. And it also some of the articles coming out of the local papers are talking about how it seems like some candidates are running who otherwise wouldn't have run before. So I think we're seeing more ideas come out that otherwise wouldn't have come out. And so we're excited for them. And we've seen another story play out in St. Louis as well.
Yeah, tell me about that. Tell me about St. Louis.
So in St. Louis, I'd actually done another podcast called 80,000 Hours. And one of the advocates in St. Louis had heard that, and that was their initial exposure to approval voting. And so they reached out to us at CS and said, hey, we've got some serious problems here in St. Louis. And also for them, like they also had a voting machine issue, which it couldn't handle some of the other alternative voting methods, which, by the way, like it's not like approval voting, in addition to being simple, also performs a lot better than these other voting methods as well, like including some of the ranking ones. So just because the voting machine infrastructure is poor and it fits well with approval voting, even if your infrastructure for voting machines is strong and you have more advanced voting machines, approval voting is still going to make sense in that situation just because it performs so well.
Yeah.
And so in St. Louis, there was an issue with one of the previous elections with their mayoral election, where there was a lot of vote splitting in the progressive and Black community, and the mayor who was elected really didn't seem to represent the city in a lot of ways. In fact, there were a lot of protests going on, and during one of those, like after one of those protests, the mayor herself went out and publicly doxed, giving all the personal information of the protesters who were involved. And so it didn't really seem like she was representing the community very well. And so that was kind of like the context there. And so we worked with the local advocates and got the signature gathering. And then like as it moved towards the election, like interesting, like there was some also pushback from some of the folks in local office as well. So for example, with the St. Louis City Council, the council itself was moving to oppose the ballot initiative for approval voting, letting people choose as many candidates as they want. And in that context, they had it as the initiative was being advanced as a nonpartisan open primary with a top 2 component. So in that open primary, you could choose as many as you want, and then the top 2 candidates under approval voting would go to the general election. And the council itself was worried about the Democratic Party in this instance losing power. And again, like we come from a nonpartisan perspective, we only care about the voters in terms of like what they get as an outcome. And so here, in this case, the Democratic Party was not happy, and some of the members of the Democratic Party were on the city council. And I was at this particular meeting, and the chair for the council was saying, okay, we're going to pass this. And an independent on the council had spoken up and said, hey, do you think it's appropriate for us to oppose this initiative when clearly we're trying to do this from a party perspective interest? And the chair said, well, it's true, like the Democrats may kind of lose power in this instance, so we're going to oppose it. And they did. They passed a motion to oppose the initiative. But of course, the initiative wasn't for them ever in the first place. This was for the voters and the people of St. Louis. And they decided that they wanted it, which is why they passed it by 68%.
Yeah, that's incredible. So what I'm wondering is, how did the Center for Election Science, I mean, in both Fargo and St. Louis, it came down to the voters saying they wanted this measure on the ballot, right? To approve this idea of approval voting. So how did you raise awareness among voters to get them out to vote for this measure?
So in that instance, we really have a lot of faith in our local partners. So our local partners are really the ones running the campaign, getting that awareness out. We'll help with local interviews, but really the local groups are the change makers in this instance. They know the community, they know the people to talk with, they know the key stakeholders. So really, they're the ones who make these outcomes happen. And so we're picky with who we work with, but we've been really excited about the campaigns that have taken place so far. And we've got yet another one coming up in Seattle. Seattle has had its own issues with vote splitting, and the team that is running there is really exciting. Like they things are looking good with their signature gathering, and it looks very likely that it will be on the ballot this November. And the preliminary polling for that puts it at about 70%. So we expect another landslide victory over there, which I think will be really exciting for the folks in St. Louis. Sorry, for the folks in Seattle.
Right, right. Can you tell me about some of the methods that your local partners have been using to raise awareness about approval voting?
Yeah, so they do a lot of public events, open forums. They talk with a lot of the local papers. And another component to keep in mind is that we now have a nationwide chapter system where we work with some of these folks in these communities, and we kind of work to cultivate them. Some of them come in with like existing skills that make this a bit easier. But we also have this program run by our director of campaigns and advocacy, Chris Rowley. He put together this program that helps with skill development for folks who are in these local chapters for approval voting across the country, and getting them prepared to be able to run an initiative. And so these folks in St. Louis had actually gone through this nationwide chapter system. And so we're even more really proud of them for the progress that they've made.
Yeah, so what kind of skills are you working on developing in these partners?
So some of it is thinking about identifying who key stakeholders are within a particular community, storytelling, them talking about their own experiences with politics, their own experiences with maybe not being able to vote the way that they wanted, and also reminding the people of their community of some pretty bad elections that they've had, not necessarily in terms of like a particular winner, but just seeing it and saying, okay, well, there is so much vote splitting going on in this election. Can we really tell whether this person was the right winner? And even if the winner doesn't change, there's an issue of like, well, if this person won with like 35% support, even if they were the correct winner or the best candidate, like that's hardly a mandate. If a winner doesn't get to see their true support, it's very difficult for them to have the political muster to be able to push forward, in some cases, really necessary aggressive policies. So there are a number of side effects of having this really terrible voting method, in addition to sometimes just flat out getting the winner wrong.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. So what advice would you give to nonprofit leaders who are listening, who they have their own advocacy initiatives that they want to get on the ballot, perhaps?
So for us, this was really challenging. and other folks may find themselves in a similar situation. So we earlier on, like for like a lot of nonprofits, like our earlier years, we had no money, and so when you don't have much money, one thing that is free other than time is um, uh, thinking about the content space. And so for us, we spent a lot of time thinking about which voting method made sense. So we started in agnostic about which voting method we wanted to advance. And approval voting hit, like, really check these boxes of good winner selection, good measure of support for each candidate, which, by the way, for those there are a bunch of ways of studying that. We've since studied this empirically using a, a controlled design, which is now published in the European Journal of Political Economy. I was an author on that particular paper. So like it was the first one of the first studies where there was an actual control measure involved, where we could see the discrepancy between the support for each candidate with a particular voting method and this honest assessment scale kind of control measure. And so we know empirically that approval voting does a good job on these components. And so it checked these boxes, and also like the practicality components, so like easy to understand, easy to implement. And the challenge for us was this wasn't being used for government elections. Like it was being used for contexts in academia and other types of groups. And so one concept that kind of carries over when running an organization, particularly if this particular intervention hasn't been tried as much before, is being able to demonstrate proof of concept, and then like replication and scaling. And so that's one stage that we are now working on passing. And so, for example, like Fargo was the first city in the entire country to use approval voting ever. And we were able to make that happen within a year of our initial funding. So within a year of our initial funding, we hired staff and implemented approval voting in its first city. And then we had to replicate that in St. Louis. And then each one, like, we're really scaling it as well by more than twofold. So Fargo is 120,000 people. St. Louis is 300,000 people. Seattle is 750,000 people. And then like we're getting ready to move into the states as well, which will be more than double the size of Seattle. So that's one thing that I would maybe think about, is looking at maybe not trying to bite off too much more than you can chew initially if you're taking a ballot initiative route. And then also there are some like technical components too, is like once you get to a certain size, there are like some technical limits within a C3 in terms of what you can spend on campaign. So it may be necessary, which we're doing in the process of, is setting up a 501c4 in addition to the C3 that you have.
Right. That was one question I had for you too regarding advocacy. A lot of 501c3 nonprofit leaders are afraid to get involved in advocacy, especially things that have to do with voting, because they're afraid of jeopardizing their 501c3 status. They're afraid of one specific type of advocacy, which is called lobbying. So how do you, as a 501c3 at the Center for Election Science, how do you kind of balance that?
So I'm gonna kind of get into a technical discussion. I'm also, as an aside, a licensed attorney, which is helpful in being able to navigate all this. So the IRS has two tests. One is a substantial part test, which is the test that you're automatically entered into if you don't do anything, and that's a subjective test. It just says that you don't spend a substantial part of the nonprofit's energy, not necessarily money, it could be volunteer stuff, towards lobbying, or like getting some kind of legislation to pass, for example, which is different than saying vote for this party or vote for this candidate, which a 501c3 can't do under any circumstances. And so the downfall of that substantial part test is it's a bit vague. Like there are no numbers associated with it, and so it can make you feel a little bit unsure, which is maybe when you're talking about your C3 status, not something you want to feel too unsure about. So a lot of nonprofits opt in using, I think it's a Schedule H form, to this other test called the expenditure test. And the expenditure test uses this kind of progressive scale, kind of like a tax bracket type scale, that says if this is your nonprofit's expenditures minus what you spend on fundraising firms, which is a kind of a weird thing to subtract. So your expenditures minus what you spend on fundraising firms. I didn't make up these rules. And then like that's the bracket then you're in, and then there's a amount over and above, like, so if say like your organization is like spends like $1 million a year, you look at the previous bracket and it's like you can spend like this much money plus a percentage of anything spent above that, is basically how it works. Kind of like how income tax works. So it's the same kind of setup. And and there's also like this window for that, to give you a little bit of a buffer, and they give you even more of a buffer. So like they just kind of tax you if you go over a particular amount, and then if you go over like the buffer zone, then you have to worry. But the expenditure test makes it a lot easier. But even with the expenditure test, there are limits there. And if you're talking about a super expensive campaign, like at a state level, for instance, it gets crazy expensive. Just to get an initiative on the ballot for a mid-sized state can cost $10 million. It's crazy. And when you start to deal in those numbers, you have to think of an alternative approach, and that's where 501c4s come in. So a lot of 501c3s have a kind of sister 501c4 organization that's still independent. So like you have different books and everything. And so you have this other organization, and for a 501c4, it doesn't have the benefit of donors being able to make a tax deduction when they give to them, but a 501c4 doesn't have any limits in terms of what it can spend on lobbying. So it can spend as much money as it wants telling people to vote a certain way on an initiative, for instance.
And I know that a lot of nonprofits, lobbying isn't even something that they necessarily are looking to get involved in. So just using the Center for Election Science as an example, what are some activities that you guys or your partners get involved in that are advocacy efforts to promote approval voting without being lobbying specifically?
Yeah, so for something to qualify as lobbying, it has to do a couple of things. Like it has to do two things. It has to identify specifically the initiative itself, and the second component is in identifying the initiative itself, it has to tell you to vote one way or the other on that initiative. And here I'm just talking about initiatives. You can't do anything as it relates to candidate races. Like you can't say anything in that context. Yeah, as long as you're not doing those two things, you're not lobbying. You can educate about initiative without telling people to vote one way or the other about it. And as long as you're not telling them to vote one way or the other, you're fine.
So can I, if I were working for the Center for Election Science, can I say, here are the benefits of approval voting?
Yeah, particularly in that context, you're not even mentioning an initiative. So that wouldn't trigger the test.
Yeah. Yeah. So nonprofits can get involved in spreading awareness about why a certain method of supporting or going against their mission is beneficial to the community without actually engaging in lobbying and worrying about their 501c3 status.
Right. Yeah. And there, like, I think it's important too, like one, like in that kind of context, if you're not mentioning a specific initiative, like it's not triggering the lobbying. And then the other component is like, even in cases when you are triggering the lobbying, like you're not barred from lobbying. You just are limited to the extent that you can do so.
Right, right, absolutely. Well, I know you also, like you mentioned, you are an attorney, Aaron, and you have, I know, a personal website that you keep with different resources for nonprofit leaders. And I'd love if you could share that with listeners so they can check out those resources.
Yeah. So my in addition to being able to check out our work at electionscience.org, highly recommend it. Tons of great stuff there. Get involved with our chapter system, change the world, give yourself real agency when you go to vote, so you can use approval voting and not this terrible choose one nonsense that we're stuck with now. Um, and so uh, after you're done checking electionscience.org, you can, if you look at aaronhamlin.com, um, I just write a lot of essays, and one of the some of the things that I write about. So I've got a bunch of essays on voting theory, which if you want to go down that rabbit hole, there's plenty to look at. I had started another organization that focused on bringing new male contraceptives to market. So I talk a bit about contraceptive technology and what it means like to move a product to market in the pharmaceutical industry. And so if you go past those, there are some other ones. There's a section on nonprofits where it talks about uh, an article on like what it means to be a good board member, how to expedite your 501c3 status, how to start up a how to start up a nonprofit to begin with. There's a bunch of articles on technical aspects of philanthropy. So articles about donor advised funds, planned giving, technical aspects of giving as it relates to maximizing tax efficiency, and then I've got some other kind of miscellaneous ones. There's like one on like how to memorize a deck of cards. There's another one on how to keep your bike safe. One of my side hobbies is lock picking, so I think a bit about security in a different way, and so I've got an essay about layered security when you're thinking about making sure your bike isn't stolen.
That's so fun. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Aaron. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.